Having navigated the quiet, reflective island of the watch, our farmer, Jean, once again feels the gentle, irresistible pull of slumber. This is not the same overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion that dragged him down into the first sleep. That was a desperate plunge, a physical necessity. This is different. This is a softer, more willing surrender. It is a gentle, drifting descent. His body, already rested, and his mind, calmed and cleared by the quiet interlude, are now ready for the second and final act of the night's drama. He is ready for the second sleep. He settles back into the rustling straw of the family bed. The warmth of his family's bodies is a deep comfort. The fire, which he tended just an hour ago, now burns with a low, steady glow, casting a soft and stable light throughout the small hut. The world feels secure, settled, and safe. As he closes his eyes, he is not falling into a dark and dreamless abyss. Instead, he is wading into a different kind of consciousness, a lighter, more buoyant state of being. This second sleep, the secundus somnus, was known to be a fundamentally different experience from the first. It was the realm of the dream. Sleep scientists today could explain this phenomenon with precision. In a natural biphasic sleep cycle, the deep, restorative slow-wave sleep tends to be concentrated in the first half of the night. The second half of the night, by contrast, is dominated by rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, and lighter stages of non-REM sleep. And REM sleep, as we now know, is the biological engine of vivid, narrative dreaming. Our ancestors, of course, did not have the language of sleep science, but they knew this reality intimately. They knew from 1,000 nights of lived experience that the second sleep was when the soul went traveling. As Jean drifts off, his thoughts begin to lose their sharp, logical edges. The boundary between his inner world and the outer world begins to dissolve. The low hum of the fire might transform into the drone of a summer bee in a dream of a meadow. The soft breathing of his child might become the sound of gentle waves on a forgotten shore. His mind begins to weave the raw materials of his life, his memories, his hopes, his deep-seated fears, into elaborate and often surreal tapestries. In his dreams, he might find himself soaring over his fields like a hawk, able to see his entire world laid out below him. This was a common dream archetype, a feeling of exhilarating freedom from the relentless gravity of his daily life. He might dream of a conversation with his deceased father, his face as clear and as real as it was in life, offering a piece of cryptic but deeply meaningful advice. For Jean, this was not a psychological manifestation of grief. It was a genuine visit, a message from the world beyond. The spiritual beliefs explored in ancient civilizations had not vanished. They had simply been absorbed into the folk Christianity of the medieval peasant. The second sleep was a time when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the spirits was at its thinnest. The dreams of the second sleep were taken very seriously. While the first sleep was for the body, the second sleep was for the soul and the mind. It was a source of information, of insight, of prophecy. A farmer might dream of a field of plump, healthy wheat and take it as a good omen for the coming harvest. He might dream of a sick cow and wake with a sense of foreboding, checking on his livestock with extra care that morning. These were not mere fantasies. They were considered a form of nocturnal intelligence, a different way of knowing. This belief was not confined to the peasant class. The literate elite were fascinated by the dreams of the second sleep. They wrote about them, analyzed them, and tried to understand their meaning. They believed, as Aristotle had suggested centuries before, that dreams were often connected to the state of the body. A dream of fire or battle might be interpreted as a sign of an excess of choler or yellow bile in the body's humoral system, a sign of a fever to come. A physician might ask a patient not just about their physical symptoms, but about the content of their dreams, using them as a diagnostic tool. Moreover, the second sleep was seen as a source of creative and intellectual inspiration. The mind, having rested and then been gently stimulated during the watch, was now in a highly associative and creative state. It was in the dreams of the second sleep that a craftsman might suddenly envision a new way to build a joint, or a poet might hear a perfect line of verse. This was a common phenomenon we still recognize today. The experience of waking up with a solution to a problem that seemed impossible the night before. Our ancestors simply formalized this experience, recognizing the second sleep as a reliable and potent source of creative insight. The end of the second sleep was just as gentle as its beginning. It did not end with the jarring, artificial violence of an alarm clock. It ended with the first faint light of dawn. The light would slowly begin to filter through the cracks in the hut's walls or through the single, small, unglazed window. The world outside would begin to stir. The first bird would begin its song, a single clear note in the pre-dawn stillness. Then another would join, and another, building into the great chorus of the dawn. This slow, gradual increase in light and sound was a natural and gentle wake-up call. It was a signal to the brain to slowly suppress the production of melatonin and begin producing the hormones of wakefulness, like cortisol. Jean would not be ripped from his dreams. He would float up from them, often bringing back fragments and feelings from his nocturnal journeys. He would wake slowly, the dream world fading as the real world came into focus. He would rise, not with a sense of groggy disorientation, but with a feeling of completeness. His body was rested from the first sleep. His mind was cleared and enriched by the watch and the dreams of the second sleep. He had completed the night's full, two-act journey. He was ready to greet the rising sun and begin the labors of a new day. This was the gift of the divided night, a structure that provided not just rest for the body, but also space for the mind and nourishment for the soul.
For century upon century, the rhythm of the two sleeps remained the unchallenged and universal pattern of the night. It was a rhythm born of darkness, a human adaptation to a world that was plunged into profound blackness with the setting of the sun. But this ancient and deeply ingrained pattern was about to face its first great adversary. The adversary was not a new philosophy or a new religion. It was something far more tangible and ultimately far more powerful: artificial light. The story of how we lost the divided night begins not with a bang, but with a faint, flickering glow in the streets of the great European cities. It begins with the first hesitant war on darkness. Let us transport ourselves to the late 17th century, to the burgeoning metropolis of Paris under the rule of the Sun King, Louis XIV. The Paris of this time was a city of stark contrasts. By day, it was a bustling, vibrant center of commerce and culture. By night, it was a dangerous and forbidding labyrinth. Its narrow, winding streets, slick with mud and refuse, became treacherous and pitch black after sunset. Crime was rampant. People would scurry home before dark, barring their doors and windows, effectively surrendering the city to the night. But in 1667, a royal decree changed everything. The king's lieutenant general of police, Gilbert Nicolas de la Reynie, ordered the installation of thousands of lanterns throughout the city's streets and squares. These were not the bright, powerful lamps we know today. They were simple lanterns, a glass box containing a single, thick tallow candle. Special lamplighters were employed to go out at dusk, light each candle with a long pole, and then return at dawn to extinguish them. The light they produced was not brilliant. It was a soft, flickering yellow glow, creating small pools of light separated by stretches of deep shadow. It was just enough to see the path in front of you, to recognize a face, to deter a lurking thief. This act, seemingly simple, was utterly revolutionary. It was a declaration of intent. The night itself could be tamed. The city no longer had to die when the sun went down. This idea spread like fire across Europe. London soon followed, installing its own system of oil lamps. Then came Amsterdam, Turin, and other major cities. For the first time in human history, the urban night began to have its own distinct life, separate from the great natural rhythm of the planet. The initial and most profound effect of this new public light was on the social habits of the wealthy elite. The aristocracy and the rising merchant class, who lived in the fashionable city centers where these lamps were first installed, found their days suddenly and wonderfully extended. The night was transformed from a time of quiet domesticity and early sleep into a new frontier for social activity. The evening, as we know it, that period of social life between the end of the workday and the beginning of sleep, was born in the glow of these first street lamps. Imagine a wealthy Parisian nobleman. He no longer needed to rush home at dusk. He could now safely travel in his carriage through the illuminated streets to attend a salon, a literary gathering where the city's great minds would debate philosophy and art. He could go to the theater to see the latest play by Molière, emerging from the performance into a street that was no longer pitch black and threatening. He could attend lavish, multi-course dinner parties that started at an hour when his peasant counterparts were already deep in their first sleep, and which might continue long past midnight. This new nocturnal social life created a powerful new pressure, the pressure to stay up late. Going to bed early, once a simple necessity for everyone, now began to be seen as rustic, unsophisticated, and provincial. It was something farmers did. If you were a person of fashion, of culture, of importance, you were active in the evening. You were seen. Your bedtime was pushed later and later, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, even midnight. And this seemingly small shift had a devastating effect on the ancient pattern of biphasic sleep. The biological mechanism of the two sleeps was predicated on a long period of darkness, typically 10 to 12 hours. This long night provided ample time for a first sleep, a waking period, and a second sleep. But a person who now goes to bed at 11 p.m. and still needs to wake up for the business of the next morning simply does not have enough time in the night to accommodate this natural rhythm. The waking period in the middle of the night, the watch, began to get squeezed from both ends. It began to lose its purpose. For an aristocrat, the quiet, contemplative time of the watch was no longer necessary. He had just spent hours socializing, his mind buzzing with conversation and wine. His need for quiet reflection was fulfilled by the new social evening. The waking period, once a welcome and productive interlude, now became an inconvenient interruption. Waking at 2 or 3 in the morning was no longer a peaceful transition, but an annoying side effect of a late night. The change was slower to reach the common people and those living in the countryside, where the nights remained as dark as they had always been. But the habits of the elite have always had a powerful aspirational pull. The wealthy began to view the single, consolidated block of sleep as a sign of a more refined, more modern lifestyle. Doctors, who primarily served these wealthy clients, began to adjust their medical advice. Whereas a 16th century physician saw the waking period as a healthy and natural part of the night, an 18th century doctor might begin to see it as a sign of poor sleep, a mild disorder to be corrected. The very language began to shift. The terms first sleep and second sleep, once common and universal, slowly began to fade from written documents and letters during the 18th century. They were replaced by a new and troubling vocabulary, phrases like a restless night or a fit of wakefulness. The experience hadn't changed, but the perception of it had. What was once a normal and expected rhythm was beginning to be pathologized. It was the first step toward the creation of the modern anxiety of insomnia. The faint, flickering glow of a few thousand street lamps did not just illuminate the cobblestones of Paris and London. It cast a long shadow on an ancient way of sleeping, beginning a process that would, over the next 2 centuries, completely reshape the human experience of the night.
If the first flickering street lamps lit the fuse of a revolution in sleep, then the roaring furnaces of the Industrial Revolution were the explosion that blew the ancient world of the two sleeps apart forever. The changes brought by the rise of factories and mass production in the late 18th and 19th centuries were not just economic and social, they were profoundly biological. This new era brought with it a new master, a new God that demanded absolute obedience and remade human life in its own image. That new God was the clock. And its tyranny would fundamentally and irrevocably alter our relationship with time, with work,
and with the very nature of rest itself. Before the Industrial Revolution, for the vast majority of people like our farmer Jean, time was a fluid, organic, and natural phenomenon. It was measured by the position of the sun in the sky, the changing of the seasons, the tolling of the church bell for morning prayer or evening curfew. The workday was task-oriented. You worked until the field was plowed, or until the sheep were sheared, or until the light failed. There was a natural rhythm to the day, a pattern of intense labor followed by periods of rest. The pace of life was the pace of the human body and the pace of the natural world. The factory shattered this reality. Imagine now, not Jean, but his great-great-grandson Thomas. The family has lost their ancestral land and has been forced to move to a booming, overcrowded industrial city like Manchester, England. The air here is thick with the black soot from countless smokestacks. The family lives in a single, damp room in a crowded tenement building. And Thomas's life is no longer governed by the sun. It is governed by the factory whistle. The whistle shrieks at 5:30 a.m., a piercing, inhuman sound that rips through the dawn, calling the entire city to work. Thomas must be at his station, in front of a deafening, clattering textile loom by 6 a.m. sharp. If he is 5 minutes late, he is fined a portion of his already meager wages. His workday is not defined by a task, it is defined by the clock. He will stand in that same spot, performing the same repetitive, mind-numbing action for 12, 14, or even 16 hours. The machine dictates the pace, a relentless, inhuman rhythm that his body must struggle to match. The whistle will shriek again in the evening, releasing him not into a time of quiet rest, but into a few precious hours of darkness before the cycle begins again. In this new and brutal reality, the biphasic sleep pattern was not just an inconvenience, it was an economic impossibility. A factory owner, whose entire enterprise was built on the principle of maximizing the productivity of his workforce and his machines, could not tolerate a worker who experienced a 1 or 2 hour period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. That was seen as unproductive downtime, a waste of potential energy. The ideal worker, from the factory owner's perspective, was like a machine himself. He should work at maximum capacity for a set number of hours and then shut down completely for a period of efficient recharging, only to be ready to power back on at the sound of the morning whistle. Thus, the single, consolidated, uninterrupted block of sleep became the new, unspoken ideal. It was no longer a matter of social fashion, as it had been for the 18th century aristocrats. It was now a matter of economic survival. Thomas needed to extract the maximum possible rest from the few short hours allotted to him. Waking for a peaceful, contemplative hour was a luxury his exhausted body could not afford. The night was no longer a landscape to be explored. It was a pit stop, a frantic and desperate attempt to refuel an utterly depleted machine. The very concept of time had been reframed. In the new capitalist mindset, time was a commodity. Time is money, as the saying went. This idea, so familiar to us, was revolutionary and deeply unsettling to the pre-industrial mind. If time is money, then any time not spent in productive labor or in the efficient recovery needed for that labor is time wasted. The quiet, unproductive, and non-commercial activities of the watch, the gentle chores, the hushed conversations, the silent prayers, had no place and no value in this new world. They were inefficiencies to be eliminated. This new industrial schedule also created a new kind of fatigue. Jean's fatigue was the deep, aching exhaustion of the muscles, a physical debt that the first sleep was perfectly designed to repay. Thomas's fatigue was something different. It was the exhaustion of the factory, a combination of physical weariness, profound mental boredom from the repetitive tasks, and the constant grinding stress of the noisy, dangerous environment. His nervous system was in a state of perpetual, low-grade agitation. This often made sleep, even when desperately needed, difficult to achieve. Many workers, despite their exhaustion, would lie in their beds with their minds racing, their bodies still vibrating with the rhythm of the machines. This gave rise to a new demand for artificial aids to sleep. This was the era when cheap, potent alcohol like gin became rampant in the industrial slums, often used as a desperate way to knock oneself out at the end of a brutal day. Patent medicines and opiates like laudanum became widely available and were used by all social classes to force the mind into the state of unconsciousness that the industrial world demanded. People began to look for an external switch to turn off their consciousness, because the natural, gentle process of surrendering to sleep was being constantly undermined by the stresses of their waking lives. The factory whistle was a declaration of war on the body's natural rhythms. It demanded that everyone, regardless of their individual chronotype, whether they were a natural lark or a night owl, adhere to a single, rigid, and artificial schedule. It taught humanity that our own internal clocks were irrelevant. The only clock that mattered was the one on the factory wall. This powerful and painful lesson, learned over generations of industrial labor, reshaped our collective consciousness. We became alienated from the natural cycles of our own bodies. We came to see sleep not as a gentle multi-stage journey, but as a single utilitarian task to be completed as efficiently as possible. The tyranny of the clock was absolute, and in its relentless ticking, the ancient divided night breathed its last breath.
As the Industrial Revolution was reshaping the public world of work and time, a quieter but equally profound revolution was taking place inside the home. This revolution was not about machines and schedules, but about walls and doors. It was the story of the birth of the modern bedroom, and with it, the birth of the modern idea of privacy. The transformation of the sleeping space from a bustling, communal, multi-purpose area into a silent, private, and personal sanctuary would fundamentally alter the very experience of going to sleep, turning it from a social act into a deeply individual one. Let us once again return to the world of our medieval farmer, Jean. As we remember, his one-room hut was the stage for every aspect of his family's life. They cooked, ate, worked, socialized, and slept in that single shared space. The family bed was not just for sleeping, it was a piece of furniture for sitting on during the day,
a play area for the children, a place where Isabel might give birth, and where the family would gather around a dying relative. There was no concept of the bedroom as a space exclusively for sleep. Sleep itself was a public, or at least a familial, event. This was not just true for the peasantry. Even in the grand castles of the nobility, the lord's bedchamber was a semi-public space. It was a place of power and status. Important attendants, high-ranking servants, and even favored pets would often sleep on truckle beds or pallets on the floor of their master's chamber. The act of waking the lord in the morning and helping him dress was a complex and public ceremony. The bedroom was a theater of power. This communal approach to sleep began to change with the rise of a new and powerful class in the 17th and 18th centuries, the bourgeoisie, or the middle class. Merchants, lawyers, and successful artisans began to build new kinds of homes. These homes were designed not just for survival, but for a new concept called domestic comfort. And a key feature of this new architectural style was the specialization of rooms. The house was divided into public and private zones. There was a parlor for receiving guests, a dining room exclusively for eating, and, for the first time, dedicated rooms specifically for sleeping, the bedchamber. This architectural innovation was driven by a powerful new cultural idea, the concept of the individual. As the old feudal order gave way to a more modern capitalist society, a new emphasis was placed on personal identity, inner life, and individuality. People began to see themselves not just as members of a family or a community, but as unique individuals with their own private thoughts, feelings, and desires. And this new individual needed a space to be alone. The private bedroom became the ultimate sanctuary for this emerging modern self. It was a place to retreat from the demands of the social world, a place to read a personal letter, to write in a private diary, to reflect, and to be truly, completely alone. The door to the bedroom became a powerful symbol. For the first time, a person could close a door, separating themselves from the rest of the household. This simple act created a new kind of freedom, the freedom of privacy. Inside this room, you were no longer a father, a wife, a master, or a servant. You were just yourself. This had a profound effect on the experience of sleep. Sleep was no longer a communal huddle for warmth and safety. It became a solitary journey, an act of individual retreat. The furniture and design of this new private bedroom reflected its purpose. The centerpiece was the bed itself, which became an increasingly personal and elaborate object. It was often a grand four-poster bed, hung with thick, heavy curtains. These curtains were not just for decoration or warmth. They were a room within a room, a final layer of privacy that could be drawn to create an intimate, womb-like enclosure, shutting out the last vestiges of the outside world. The room would also contain other new pieces of furniture designed for the individual: a personal washstand, a wardrobe for one's own clothes, a small desk for writing personal letters. This new privacy, however, came at a psychological cost.
While sleeping in a room full of people provided a deep, instinctual sense of security, sleeping alone could feel isolating and vulnerable. The quiet sounds of a sleeping family, the soft breathing, the occasional cough or murmur were replaced by a profound and sometimes unsettling silence. In this silence, with no external distractions, a person was left alone with their own thoughts. And for the rising middle class, whose lives were filled with the new anxieties of commerce, social status, and personal ambition, these thoughts were not always peaceful. The private bedroom, in a sense, created the perfect laboratory for the development of modern insomnia. Lying alone in the dark, a merchant might find his mind racing, endlessly calculating profits and losses. A young woman might worry about her social standing or her marriage prospects. The silence of the room amplified the noise of the mind. The very space that was designed for peaceful retreat could become a lonely echo chamber for one's own anxieties. Furthermore, the separation of the master and mistress of the house into their own private chamber, away from the children and servants, created a new set of nocturnal anxieties. Parents now worried about their children in a separate room. Were they safe? Were they sick? This led to the rise of a new ritual, the parental check-in, a quiet trip down a dark hallway to listen at a child's door, a ritual born directly from this new domestic architecture. By the end of the 19th century, the ideal of the private bedroom had become the standard for all but the very poorest in Western society. The act of sleeping had been successfully redefined. It had been transformed from a public, shared, and social experience into a private, individual, and often lonely one. We had gained a new and precious space for personal freedom and reflection, but we had lost the ancient, instinctual comfort of the communal hearth. We had barred the door against the intrusions of the outside world, but in doing so, we had also locked ourselves in with our own restless minds. The stage was now set for the final act in the pathologizing of the night, the medicalization of wakefulness itself.